Well, with apologies to everybody, I'm sorry for the late start. There is a history behind these these difficult connections, as Rob and Frank in particular know, and I'm so sorry about it. But anyway, I think you've got, I can't see the images myself, but I think you have a picture there. Rob, if you can move on to the cartoon by James Gilray. And what I want to say about that is that it's if you've heard of Garnett at all, it's almost certainly thanks to this cartoon. And what it shows is Garnett at a date that we can identify very precisely in March 1800. And as you can see, he's administering nitrous oxide to an elderly subscriber at the Royal Institution. And the results were embarrassing. In fact, they were so spectacular that they're recorded with some glee in the diary of the great society gossip of the day, Lady Holland. And it's, in some ways, I think it's a pity if you've only heard of Garnett through the cartoon. What the cartoon does is to show a particular Garnett at the height of his metropolitan fame. And for me, Garnett in reality is much more of a provincial figure, and I'd say more specifically a northern figure. But there he is in his prime, I suppose, in some way, just appointed as the Royal Institution's first professor of natural philosophy and chemistry. He'd been appointed the year before, 1799. He attracted large audiences, favourable comments in the press, just as he already done in the 3 years in which he'd been the first and only professor, again, natural philosophy and chemistry, the first and only professor at Anderson's University. That was the new Andersonian institution in Glasgow. He'd been a star in Glasgow, and it was as a star, as a lecturing star, that he was headhunted to move to London. And yet, within a couple of years of this episode in the cartoon, Garnett had resigned from the Royal Institution, and soon afterwards he died of typhus fever at the age of 36. He was the victim of a mixture of things, I think: overwork, depression following the death of his wife, and I'd have to say just straightforward bullying mainly by Count Rumford, who's the figure standing at the right of the cartoon, but also some insidious bullying, I think, by Garnett's successor as Professor of Chemistry, Humphrey Davy. And in fact, Davy appears in the cartoon. He's the figure holding the bellows. But when the real event took place, and that was March 1800, there would have been no Davy. Garnett would have been lecturing on his own. And what you have in Gilray's cartoon, in fact, is a real event interpreted with a big dose of artistic license. Now, that high profile, move on, Rob, the image, please. In that high profile, those 5 years of prominence, if we include the Glasgow years, they invite questions. And they're the questions that I've tried to answer in the biography of Garnett that I published a month or so ago. I mean, the question obviously is, how did Garnett get there? How did he get to Glasgow? How he then to Mayfair? And all that from the profoundly yeoman world of his childhood in rural Westmorland. I mean, for centuries, Garnetts had never moved more than a few miles from their tiny home village of Barben near Kirby Lonsdale. But now, in his early mid-30s, there's Garnett suddenly achieving national celebrity. Now, in my summary, I say I'm uneasy about the rags to riches model. I mean, at the rags end, for example, the model for me just doesn't quite work. Okay, at the time of Garnett's birth, 1766, rural life was tough. It was also a time when the better off yeoman families were becoming more prosperous, to the point of owning property, an important point in yeoman history, I think, in country history, to the point of owning property, owning their own houses. Rob, the next image, please. Owning their own houses, as the Garnets did. And this
right.
is the...
Sorry, Rob, can you keep the microphone close to this phone?
Probably
Because Rob
rebuilt
keeps
more
fading in
likely
and out.
by Garnet's grandfather about 1740. And another change, and it's related, of course, was that the sons of these better off yeoman families to look for livelihoods beyond the family plot. And typically that would be in one of the local market towns. It might be Kirkby Lonsdale, Kendal, might be the port of Lancaster, 20 miles away. I mean, these places were geographically quite close, but culturally they're a world away from agricultural toil. And what's striking about these new opportunities that were opening up by the mid-18th century is that they rewarded newer modern forms of knowledge that was often rooted in science. The next image, please, Rob. And on the larger national scale, and looking at the particular case of chemistry more than 30 years ago, Jan Galinsky showed how chemical knowledge in particular became a commodity, became a saleable commodity in precisely Garnett's period. And since then, I mean, Jan, as we know in the other book that's on the screen there, Jan has shown how Humphrey Davy fashioned his career using precisely that commodity, the commodity of chemical knowledge. Next slide, Rob. A contemporary, I think, who knew this very well was Samuel Johnson. I mean, there's a comment by Johnson, recorded by Boswell, of course, 1773. Johnson talks about learning having become a trade, a commodity that's addressed not to a patron or a small private circle, but to what he calls the multitude. And it's really in that sense, it's in Johnson's sense, that I've tried to portray Garnett as a trader in what I call in the book the marketplace of knowledge. Next slide, Rob, please. Now, of course, traders need something to trade with, and Garnett acquired plenty of that when the family apprenticed him to this quite remarkable person, John Dawson. John Dawson, who was from a yeoman family himself. He was a surgeon apothecary, but also a self-taught mathematician, mathematical teacher in the small market town of Sedbergh, which is just a few miles up the road from Garnett's Barben. And in 4 years as an apprentice with Dawson, Garnett learnt the routines of country medicine. I mean, he'd set bones, deliver babies, prescribed medicine, so there was plenty of chemistry of a sort as well, some mathematics, even some philosophy. I mean, when Garnett moved to Sedbergh, Dawson was writing an attack on Joseph Priestley's doctrine of philosophical necessity. So there was a lot to assimilate and a lot more to come when, on Dawson's advice, Garnett moved on 3 years of medical study at Edinburgh. And those were a heady 3 years in the mainstream curriculum. Garnett would hear Cullen and Black, all the great Edinburgh professors. He was elected president of 2 of the student medical societies. And I think crucially, in the extra academical world, Edinburgh world of lecturing, he became a convinced Brunonian, and he remained a Brunonian to the end of his life. Now, there, I think chance looms large. Next slide, Rob, please. When Garnett arrived in 1785, Edinburgh was in the throes of a conflict between traditional medicine, essentially the medicine of Cullen, and this rival Brunonian system of John Brown. Now, I could say quite a lot more about Brown, his drunkenness, and about the content of the system. Perhaps for the moment it's just enough to say that Brown saw his system as being scientific, much more so than Cullen's system, and he saw himself as being, in some sense, the Newton of medicine. But they were big claims, but very typical of the grandiose personality that was Brown. Well, it was a captivating idea, this idea of overturning the traditional medicine associated with Cullen and his circle. And Garnett, like many of his student contemporaries, one has to say, was captivated, and he came down on the Brunonian side. So those were heady days in Edinburgh. And by the time Garnett left in 1788, he left with an MD thesis for a thesis, with an MD degree rather, for a thesis on vision. He had plenty to trade with, and the marketplace for knowledge was booming. And it was the marketplace that Arnold Thackeray described 50 years ago in a classic article entitled Natural Knowledge in Cultural Context. It appeared in the American Historical Review, 1974, and what Thackeray did in the article was to show how expanding, industrializing Manchester sucked in new men, often medical men, the men who led the new Literary and Philosophical Society, which had been founded a few years before as a sort of cultural buffer against the rawness of the town. Well, Thackeray called it the Manchester model, and Garnett would have been a perfect model for one of Thackeray's new men. His choice, though, wasn't Manchester. His choice was Bradford. Now, Bradford was expanding just as quickly as Manchester, with its own speciality, not of cotton, but of worsted yarn and cloth. It was the woolen capital of the north, of the industrial north. And what Bradford offered, as Manchester did, was patience. And like Manchester, though, Bradford was raw, it was unformed, and it had a tradition, probably more than Manchester even, I think, of riots and protests. I mean, against the price of corn, or protests in favor of the radicals, John Wilkes, Tom Paine, and so on. And I think altogether it was just too raw for Garnett. He needed a vibrant marketplace, but he didn't want one that was so disorderly as to make trade difficult. So Bradford didn't work out, but only 20 miles away from Bradford, there were less turbulent opportunities in the emerging spa town of Harrogate. Now, Garnett, of course, wasn't the first to spot the potential, the commercial potential of mineral water treatments. I mean, doctors for decades had targeted patients who'd pay whatever it took for relief from the great scourges of the day. I mean, for men, that was mainly seemed to be gout or the stone. For women, hypochondria, or what were collectively called nervous diseases. Next image, Rob, please. Now, Harrogate, of course, didn't have the social cash of Bath or Tunbridge Wells, and in some quarters, in fact, it had a bad press. And I think on the screen there you have a picture of Harrogate about this time, so probably the 1770s, 1780s, and above it there's a quotation from Smollett's novel, which actually I think is an expression of Tobias Smollett's own view of Harrogate, which was that it was a wild and windswept place without cultivation, without sophistication. That's certainly how it appeared to Smollett in the 1770s. But there's no doubt that by the time Garnett arrived as a newly fledged doctor in Harrogate in the 1790s, Harrogate was very much on the up. And that was mainly because of the diversity of the waters that it offered. It had the chalybeates, it had these iron-bearing waters that you could find quite a few other spa towns, particularly Tunbridge Wells was famous for these iron waters, but it also had sulphur wells. And of course, as we know, that entailed these disgusting smells of H2S. So it was very unpleasant to be close to those, but there was the belief that they were effective. And the variety of the wells and their proximity to one another in the centre of Harrogate meant that in a very small area you could mix the two. And it was often suggested that you could go to one of the sulphur wells in the morning. I mean, you might bathe in the sulphur water if you had a skin complaint. You might drink it as a purgative. And then the iron-bearing waters in the afternoon, which you drink as a tonic. And whatever your rhythm during the day, spa doctors, of course, would be on hand to tell you for a fee exactly how you should pace your consumption. Well, the result was a, next picture please, Rob. The result was a fiercely competitive market, and Garnett was very ambitious, set his stall accordingly. I mean, what you see there, I think on the left of the screen, is an alluring portrait of him. It's a sort of trade poster for his trade. And next to him is a Nuth's apparatus, which was for preparing carbonated water. And that we don't really know the origin of that portrait, but it looks as though it was a print based on a painting from the early 1790s, soon after Garnett's arrival in Harrogate. And then, as well as the portrait, there was what really mattered to Garnett, and that was the science. Garnett arrived fresh from Edinburgh. He's loaded with science, and he's loaded with medicine that was scientific in the way Erasmus Darwin thought it should be at about the time. And I mean, in his Zoonomia, Darwin talks about the ideal physician. He says, you know, no physician can direct a method of cure without theorizing, and happy, therefore, is the patient whose physician possesses the best theory. And for Garnett, theory meant the analysis of the waters. Rob, next picture, please. It meant a large scholarly looking book. That's the treatise on the mineral waters of Harrogate that was in the previous slide, that was displayed in the previous slide. And that was a huge compendium of the Harrogate waters, their nature, how to use them, and so on. And with, as part of the compendium, there were tables like this one, designed to evoke precision, accuracy, I mean, reliability, authority, of course. Next slide, please. Well, it's no wonder, I think, that the established doctors, the old guard, the empirics, they regarded Garnett with suspicion. And the result was a pamphlet war that was fought brutally and in public. As one fly sheet, I mean, there are one or two, couple of extracts there on the screen, as one fly sheet attacking Garnett put it, and chemical knowledge alone will never raise your name as a physician, nor will a diploma from any college stand in competition with medical skill acquired by real practice. That was a typical statement on the part of the established physicians who were in place when Garnett arrived. And on it went. It was all rough stuff, to the point that Garnett challenged two of his medical adversaries to a duel. I mean, as far as we know, neither duel took place, but I think you'd have to say that the challenges were very definitely for real. Still, next slide, Rob, still stressful, I think, though it must have been, Harrogate was good for Garnett. He found a wealthy patron in the person of Alexander Wedderburn, Lord Loughborough. I mean, Wedderburn was pretty dodgy, I mean, unreliable anyway, politically, but he was the doctor's dream because he was a chronic sufferer from gout and he believed in the efficacy of the waters. To the point that he built this rather grand house, Wedderburn House, specifically so he would have a home in Harrogate that would allow him to be treated. And it was here in Wedderburn House that Garnett, who was lodged in the house as well, that Garnett met his wife. And everything you'd have thought pointed to his staying on. He was doing well. But there I think you come up against one of the frustrations of scientific biography when you have to deal with the particularities of individual temperament and mood. It's not just chance. Temperament and mood sort of kick in time, and they certainly do in the case of Garnett. Because now, I think throughout his life, Garnett had a chronically depressive side, which meant that while he enjoyed the sparkling society of the spa season, that would be in the summer months, the long Yorkshire winters weighed heavily. And also kicking in was insatiable ambition. Garnett was never satisfied with what he had achieved. He was always looking for something more, to be better, to surpass what he'd already got. And after 4 years as a spa doctor, successful years by any standards, brilliantly successful years by any standards, he was eyeing another market, the market of America, and that meant almost certainly Philadelphia. Sold up in Harrogate, took everything he possessed to the quayside at Liverpool, and it was only because of a chance delay in securing a passage, it was only because of that he was persuaded to unpack his scientific instruments and give some impromptu lectures. Well, the lectures were a success. Garnett repeated them in Manchester, and it was while he was in Manchester, I mean, chance entered again. It was while he was in Manchester that he saw the announcement of the chair at the Andersonian. He applied, was appointed, and of course all thought of emigration disappeared, and he was on his way to Glasgow. And he's on his way, if you like, to the part of the story that I began with. He's on his way to those 5 years of national success, national visibility as professor at the Andersonian and then at the Royal Institution, and beyond the RI finally, after his resignation from the RI, to the unhappy end of his death from typhus fever in London. And I think, Rob, if you move on, please, I think the brutality of Garnett's fall in those last two and a half years in London emerges pretty clearly from these two, which are the two last portraits of him. I mean, on the left, you have Garnett in his prime. He's a commanding figure. This portrait was done soon after his arrival at the Royal Institution. And on the right, and this is done after his leaving the RI, you have somebody who's really just destroyed, defeated by his misfortunes. So what, to conclude, are we left with? Are we left with a failure? I don't think so. I think this was a man who succeeded, exploited every opportunity as a spa doctor, who succeeded successively as the founding professor in two groundbreaking educational institutions of national importance, the Andersonian, the RI. And after all, as a professor, he was celebrated enough to have his portrait painted 5 times in those 5 years of national fame. And just to pursue that thought of him as a professor, I think in Garnett we certainly have the example of a great society lecturer. And you can see that in the Gilray cartoon, which shows him in this society, high society mode, this Mayfair mode, if you like. But so far as we can reconstruct Garnett's lecturing style from other sources, he was, and I think this is more important and the key to his success in many respects, he was a teacher. There's evidence that he was careful, methodical, rather than flamboyant, despite the Gilray cartoon. And it was said of him that his main aim was to be understood, and above all, to be understood by women. And certainly Garnett was a great advocate of the presence of women on an equal footing at his lectures and indeed in education generally. So you have evidence of success in Harrogate, success in Glasgow, and at least initially success in London. And then I think for us as historians looking at this period, the type of person that Garnett was, there's the social mobility that he achieved through science, mobility from Barben to Mayfair and the West End. Now, it certainly wasn't a unique trajectory, but it was still spectacular. And what I try to argue in the book, it was very much of its time, a time of new opportunity, a special time, I think, that time being the last quarter of the 18th century, the 1780s, 1790s in particular. But what about Garnett, the man of science? I think there it's all a bit trickier. In the content of his science, he was resolutely modern-minded. He was international in outlook. He knew the French literature, chemical literature, particularly well. He's one of the first British chemists to teach the new French chemistry. But in science, he really was more of a follower than an innovator. If you look at his analyses of the Harrogate waters, for example, he comes across as a follower above all of Torben Bergman in Sweden. And that said, though, he executed Bergman's techniques meticulously, so meticulously that his results, his analyses of the Harrogate waters remained standard until Hoffman, A.W. Hoffman, introduced far better laboratory techniques in the 1850s. And that's no mean achievement. As Chris Hamlin points out in his book on water and water analysis was, and Chris uses this phrase, and it's sort of derived, I suppose, from Bergman in the first place, this phrase that water analysis was the most difficult operation, particularly the evaporation to dryness. So no small achievement in terms of practical chemistry as well as theory. But in 1802, it was all snuffed out when Garnett was 36, which leaves us with what might have been questions. What might have happened if Garnett had lived on long enough to keep Davy out of the picture at the RI? Would Garnett have had would Garnett, for example, have risen in the Royal Society or in high metropolitan society in the way that Davy did? Would he have had the sharp elbows, the social dexterity of a Davy? Well, there, my sense, as some of you, and I think particularly of Frank, who's been a companion along the way, after living with Garnett for more years than I care to remember, my sense is that there was a diffidence, a vulnerability about Garnett that would always have inhibited him and prevented him from being another Davy. So in one way, Garnett was very like Davy in his move from rural obscurity to national prominence, but in other ways, I think Garnett was no way, but in a way that did characterize him in the way of character, in the way of human feelings. I think in sensitivity to others, I'd want to say that was no bad thing. Well, thank you very much, and I'm sorry for the the difficulty of communication, but it's been fun, as it always is, talking about Garnett. So thank you very much indeed.